Continuing on with Chapter 33, we're looking at the Great Depression from FDR's New Deal standpoint, his plan to fix the Depression. Now, where we left off, we were talking about the plight of farmers and the creation of the AAA as a way to ease farmers' suffering. Farmers were especially hard hit out on the Great Plains because of the Dust Bowl. This is probably the worst ecological disaster in the United States for a very long time. And the Dust Bowl would have happened anyway. It just so happened that it happened right during the Great Depression, which only exacerbated the problems they faced. So years of drought, overproduction on the Great Plains, those dry farming techniques that we talked about where they had very shallow type crops, and the plowing of the Great Plains over the years has pulverized the soil into this dusty powder. And so starting around 1933, we see millions upon millions of tons of topsoil reduced to powder and blew away in huge windstorms. People literally suffocated to death if caught in the middle of one of these dust storms. And so the Dust Bowl, as if farmers didn't have enough problems out on the Great Plains, only added to their problems. And so we see the mass exodus of Okies and Arkies from Oklahoma and Arkansas to get out of the Great Plains and move to states like California, about 350,000 of them leaving to find work elsewhere. The federal government, though, trying to help farmers as much as they can. 1934, Congress passed the Frazier-Lemke Farm Bankruptcy Act to suspend farm foreclosures for 5 years to try to stop that bleeding that was going on with farm foreclosures. This was also overturned by the conservative Supreme Court, found it unconstitutional. As a way to help fix some of the problems on the Great Plains, the CCC was sent in to plant about 200 million trees on the prairies as a way to try to root the soil down. And then separate from the Dust Bowl, but aimed at a different kind of farmer, is the Indian New Deal, or the Indian Reorganization Act. This was passed in 1934 to reverse that Dawes Severalty Act that we talked about from 1887. Remember, the Dawes Severalty Act had taken away communal ownership of the tribal lands and given it to individual Native American farmers. This reverses it. It sends control back to the tribes. So there's no more forced assimilation going on. Here you see one of those dust storms during the Dust Bowl. And over here, this is a picture by a very famous photographer during the Great Depression named Dorothea Lange. She actually was a photographer for the WPA, taking pictures, almost snapshots of what the Depression looked like. This is probably her most famous picture of a migrant farm worker in California, one of those Okies escaping from the Dust Bowl. Other programs that FDR instituted with the New Deal was the creation of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Especially in rural areas like the Tennessee Valley, utility costs were at a very high. Consumers couldn't afford electricity and things like that because they were so hard hit by the Depression. So as a way to try to alleviate some of that problem, the New Deal came in and created the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a government agency where they set up hydroelectric power plants on the Tennessee Valley, at Muscle Shoals, in order to create hydroelectric power, building dams, also to create irrigation for these farmers in that area. Aside from that, they also tried to teach farmers the best farming techniques of the day, almost educate the farmers about farming, such as how to use fertilizer appropriately, crop rotation, things like that, as a way to provide more help to them. This was a central planning agency, and it absolutely was able to undercut all of the competition because the TVA didn't have to pay taxes the same way that other utility companies had to pay. So one of the major criticisms of the TVA is this is socialism. This is too much government getting involved in our daily lives. But nonetheless, it did bring a lot of hydroelectric power to areas of the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley area, and this idea would be expanded elsewhere as well. the hallmark or the clincher for the second New Deal is Social Security, probably the most remembered piece of legislation out of the New Deal because it obviously still affects us today. In 1935, Congress passed the Social Security Act to give an old age pension to retired people and also for the blind, delinquent children, aka they had been orphaned, to the handicapped, etc. And all of this was to be paid for through a payroll tax. So the way that works today is throughout the course of your life, if you work, you pay a certain percentage of your income to Social Security. Once you reach the Social Security age, you can start collecting some of that money back. We'll talk more about that later. So for the first people to get this Social Security, their first payments ranged anywhere from $10 to $85. And it's meant to provide relief for the elderly because there's no way they can continue to work. And it's also meant to stimulate the economy because now there's money in people's pockets. They can go out and buy stuff. The problem with Social Security today is that in 1945, as an example, there were 41.9 workers for every person collecting Social Security. So you see which way the flow was going. Today, there's only about 3.3 workers to every person collecting Social Security. So it's much harder to contribute or to pay for this program, hence why many politicians today worry that Social Security is going to go bankrupt. Especially since people are living longer today, they're collecting Social Security for a longer period of time. And so even though we pay into Social Security over the course of our lives, we end up collecting a whole lot more out of Social Security than we ever actually paid into it. But FDR felt that this was an important piece of legislation. We're no longer an agrarian society. We can't weather out the storms when the economy goes bad by starting a family farm. We are dependent on those boom and bust cycles. And at least to some degree, this is providing some minimum income coming in regardless of how bad the economy is. And this is absolutely part of that second New Deal, like I said, where the focus is on changing the system. Other key areas with the second New Deal, other than Social Security, the Works Progress Administration, the Wagner Act, which we're going to talk about here in a second, and Keynesian Economics, which is last. Here is FDR signing the Social Security Act into law, and one of the first recipients getting her Social Security check. Now, when it comes to labor, obviously there is a 25% plus unemployment rate in the United States at this time. It's not a really good place for labor unions to be because the idea is we can just kick you out and there'll be a whole bunch of people willing to take your place. But labor unions, nonetheless, are trying to hold on to any of the advantages that they have achieved thus far. So the summer of 1934 is really seen as a striking summer. National labor strikes going on at this time to try to get more recognition for their labor unions. So in 1935, when the NRA was ruled unconstitutional and those fair codes of conduct were ruled unconstitutional, Congress responded by replacing it with the National Labor Relations Act. This is better known as the Wagner Act, to ensure collective bargaining rights. This is the right of the people to unionize. Collective bargaining, this is the idea that if a whole bunch of workers bargain together or bargain collectively, they can get more from their employers than if they bargained independently or individually. The act also created the National Labor Relations Board to investigate claims of unfair labor practices. As a result of this, we see union membership rising like crazy. In fact, many union leaders felt that this was the, quote, Magna Carta for labor unions because it's for the first time the U.S. government recognizing people's right to unionize. And so, with the government backing up labor unions, many unions felt it was time to start pushing for more from the companies that they worked for. One such labor union was named John L. Lewis. He was the union leader for the United Mine Workers. Out of this, they created the Congress of Industrial Organization, or the CIO. This was created within the context of the AFL. They were kicked out. This is really where we see the divide. The AFL is still a skilled labor union. The CIO at this time is an unskilled labor union, and that's very, very important that you realize that. They were also kicked out, aside from being an unskilled labor union, they were also kicked out because of their sit-down strike tactic. Now, here's what they did. In an effort to unionize auto workers, John L. Lewis and the CIO went to Flint, Michigan, where General Motors was located. And what they did was they would get workers to agree that they were going to be part of the union, and then while they were on the job, in the middle of the factory at General Motors, they would literally just sit down and refuse to leave for weeks at a time even. And the idea here was that they are literally taking control of the factory. You can't bring in scab labor if the workers are literally occupying the plant where they're trying to take over. So this was a very effective strategy, simply because the factory has no choice but to recognize the union, and so they gave in to this union. Hence, why the auto workers are still such a big union today. As a result of the power that the CIO gained at the General Motors sit-down strike, we see this same attempt being used in the steel industry, focusing on organizing strikes at Republic Steel. This is known as the Little Steel Strike, trying to get this unionization going off. They refused to acknowledge this union, and as a result, we see a pretty terrible massacre in 1937. 10 people were killed at the Republic Steel Strike in the south of Chicago on Memorial Day because they were trying to unionize Republic Steel, or the Little Steel Strike. Also in 1938, still affects us today. Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is why we have a minimum wage today. The original minimum wage was set at 40 cents per hour. Obviously, it's much higher today. And a maximum hour, so that people working over that had to be paid overtime, so to speak. This, once again, is a victory for the little guy, or the grassroots, against the big business. And so, as a result of this, labor is now solidly on the Democrat side. And today, labor is still a natural constituent to the Democratic Party. Here you see the sit-down strike at Flint, Michigan, and the Memorial Day massacre of 1937 at the Little Steel Strike. Now, I've been referencing that conservative Supreme Court up until this time. The Supreme Court at this time, remember, has largely been nominated by the conservative Republicans from the 1920s. And so FDR faced a lot of opposition from them. He doesn't have yes men like he has in Congress at this time. And so time and time again, his New Deal legislation was being overturned, much to his chagrin. So FDR said, you know what, I have a mandate from the people that they want this New Deal legislation. Who are you, court, to constantly overturn my legislation? So FDR proposed in 1937 the Judiciary Reorganization Bill of 1937. This is more appropriately referred to as the Court Packing Bill. Basically, here's what FDR wanted to do. He wanted the power to appoint one new justice for every justice who was currently sitting on the Supreme Court over the age of 70, which a lot of them were. So what he's essentially asking for is to raise the number on the Supreme Court from 9 members to 15, giving him the power to put 6 new Supreme Court justices on the justice. Obviously, he's going to be the one to nominate all of those guys. He's looking to pack the court with people who are going to agree with New Deal legislation and stop overturning his New Deal legislation. This is an obvious scheme that people were very much against. Public opinion said, what about checks and balances? This is not the purpose of the Supreme Court, to be your yes men. But before this could go through, Justice Owen Roberts, who had been largely voting on the side of the conservatives, actually started switching the way that he voted against the New Deal legislation. This is popularly referred to as the switch in time that saved 9. They upheld minimum wage in 1937 when Owen Roberts switched the way he voted. And so as a result, FDR didn't need to pack the court with his guys, and so the number remains at 9 people today. Here you see 2 political cartoons. Obviously, the one on the left is referring to the old 9 that the Supreme Court is about to expand by 6 justices. And the one on the right is FDR. His only check for whether they should be on the Supreme Court is if they can say yes to FDR. Notice that the Constitution and the scales of justice have been thrown in the garbage can. All right, and last but not least, last but not least is Keynesian or Keynesian economics, however you want to pronounce it. FDR's second term, we still see a rather high unemployment rate, still around 15%, even with all of the money going into the economy. But by this point, FDR kind of lessened the amount of money that he was promoting. And in 1937, we see what's deemed the Roosevelt recession. Unemployment soared again, production was down, and many people blamed FDR. You're not doing enough. Even with all of the spending that the government was doing, it was still not enough because FDR was still trying to maintain a somewhat balanced budget. He didn't want to go too much in debt. And so at this point, because even with the spending that he was doing was not changing anything, FDR completely changed his stance. He adopted a new form of economic policy as promoted by the British economist John Maynard Keynes, or Keynes. This is massive deficit spending. This is, who cares how much it's costing? We are going to spend like crazy people, even if it means the government goes into massive amounts of debt in order to get us out of this economic crisis. And as a result of this absolutely created a massive national debt. Nowhere near of what we're going to create during the Cold War, which is after World War II, but it is setting the stage for the U.S. government spending way more than they actually could afford. But once again, if your house is on fire, you're going to do whatever you can to put out the flames. And if it means going into a massive national debt, that's what FDR was planning to do in order to get more money into the economy. This is demand-side economics. We put money in people's pockets. This creates demand, thus creates jobs in order to meet the demand that people want to buy these new products. And that is Chapter 33.